If ever there was a person who continually found himself in the middle of a storm or a crisis, but whatever he encountered, he had something insightful or profound to say, I would believe that it would be that lovable character whom Lucy always referred to by both names, Charlie Brown. One day, Charlie Brown and Snoopy were at the beach, where some of our members are, where most of us would like to be. And Snoopy spent his day out in the ocean snorkeling. He had the time of his life. Charlie Brown, being a little more reserved, spent his on the beach building a sandcastle. He spent hours building this beautiful sandcastle. Late in the afternoon, Snoopy walks up to Charlie Brown. And Charlie Brown says, "Aren't I a genius? A creative genius. Look at this masterpiece." He no more had gotten those words out when, just like that, a violent storm hit. He was pounded by the winds and the rains. And when that storm quickly went through, that sandcastle was obliterated. Charlie Brown looks at Snoopy, and with that forlorn look, says to him and to all of us, "I know there's a lesson in here somewhere, but for the life of me, I can't figure it out." Have you ever been there? You know there's a lesson in here somewhere, but right now you just can't figure it out. If you have, I'm glad you've come this morning, because I want to tell you two familiar stories that need to be read, as we said last week, more closely. They're found in God's Word. So let's open our Bibles together to Matthew chapter 14. In the Gospel according to Matthew, Jesus chose 12 ordinary men to follow him with the goal of molding and making and training and shaping and forming and transforming them into mature disciples who will live out their faith, as 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, reflecting the glory of God, and then serving the helpless and the hopeless, so that they can not only be saved, but experience the peace that passes all understanding, that guards our hearts and lives as they live out by faith the blessed life. You and I know that Jesus spent 3 years teaching his disciples how to think with a kingdom mindset, and how to live and function from a kingdom perspective. And make sure you understand this. Jesus never taught simply to dole out information. Jesus always taught for a response. He always taught for transformation and for life change. For instance, in one of the greatest sermons ever that Matthew records while he was up on a mountain, a 10-minute countercultural sermon that we could spend years studying about how to live the blessed life. How does he conclude the Sermon on the Mount? Whoever hears these sayings of mine and what? Puts them into practice is like a wise man, and when the storms of life come and hit him, his life and his house stands firm. But whoever hears them but does not put them into practice is like a foolish man, and when the storms come, both his life and his house falls flat. Jesus always taught for transformation, response, and for life change. And here at Cross Point, we're trying to do the same. So when we come to Matthew 14, Jesus has just heard the tragic news about the death of his cousin, John the Baptizer, who was brutally murdered by King Herod. Do not let that slide by. The man whom the Gospels say there was no man born that's ever been greater than John the Baptizer. And yet whoever's in the least of the kingdom is greater than the baptizer. That shows you what God feels and how he feels about you. But the baptizer has been brutally murdered. He's Jesus' cousin. And Mark says the disciples gave him an honorable burial. And then they come and find Jesus up in Galilee. And they break the news to him. Have you ever been that person who's had to break tragic news? It is not easy. Luke tells us that King Herod now puts a price tag on the head of Jesus. You want to talk about storms and grief and trouble, Jesus is up to his neck in it. Mark tells us that he invites the disciples to go with him to a solitary place on the far side of the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He just wants some alone time with them. Because for weeks, people have been tugging at him, wanting a piece of him. Do you live in that world? On this day, he goes to a solitary place to grieve where no demands should be placed upon him. Last week, we mentioned 2 spiritual disciplines that all of us should incorporate into our life, and we issued 4 challenges with each one. I hope you took them up this week about prayer and asking God to join you in the Word. The third discipline is found in verse 13 and 23. It's the one that I feel that we oftentimes neglect. It is the discipline of solitude. What is solitude? It's being still and meeting God in your secret place so that He'll fill you up and equip you to go back into the world and serve people again. I love what one writer said. The best rhythm of the Christian life is to be still in the presence of God in order to be in the presence of men and women. I personally believe that one of Satan's greatest schemes that he uses against God's people is the fiery dart of constant activity, where we're living and going and going and going and going at a breakneck speed, and if we ever do slow down, we either crash or go stir crazy needing the internet because we can't stand being still very long. And yet what does the psalmist say in Psalms 46:10? When the mountains are quaking, the earth's quaking and the mountains are roaring, be still and know that I am God. Jesus knows that. And so he and his disciples get in a boat headed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's about 4 miles away. But word travels fast in Galilee like it does in churches and in Florence. And the people hear where he's headed, and so they walk the 10 miles around the northern shore. And when Jesus and the disciples pull up, they're waiting on him. Matthew says when he saw the crowds, instead of getting upset, he had compassion on them because he lives by the principle it is not about him. Mark says that he saw them as sheep without the shepherd. If he does not minister to them, teach them, feed them, and lead them, he knows that they'll flounder and they'll be easy prey for the enemy. He cannot stand that thought. So he does what every Christian should do. He ministers to them even though he needs to be ministered to himself. Not only does he heal them, but Mark says he teaches them many things. Verse 15, Matthew says, when evening approached, the disciples told Jesus to send the crowds away so that they could go into the little villages and buy them something to eat. But Jesus' response is fascinating. He said, they don't need to go away. You need to give them something to eat. Circle the word you there. The disciples know that they are inadequate and not up to the task. Have you ever felt that way? If you have, listen closely. It's exactly where Jesus wants them, because he's going to stretch their faith. It's an uncomfortable place to be, but it is a good place to be. Have you ever noticed how that God was constantly stretching people and stretching their faith? Take Moses, Joshua, Gideon, or the disciples, for instance. They all had an overwhelming sense of inadequacy, but God wants to work on them, and He wants to work through them. And in every instance, when they surrendered to God, embraced the call, even though they felt totally inadequate, when they stepped out by faith, God used them and equipped them. It's like the old song that the Kingsmen Quartet and the Sunlight Singers used to sing, excuses, excuses. We hear them every day. In the summer it's too hot, in the winter it's too cold. In the spring when the weather's right, you got somewhere else to go. The church's benches are too hard, the singing's way too loud, and boy, you know how nervous you get when I get in a great big crowd. The doctor said, you better watch them crowds, they'll set you back, but you go to the old ball game because it helps you to relax. It's a headache Sunday morning, a backache Sunday night, but by work time Monday morning, you're feeling quite all right. And when one of the children has a cold, I guess it's pneumonia, do you suppose? Well, the whole family has to stay home just to blow that poor kid's nose. Well, the preacher, he's too young, or maybe he's too old. The sermons, they're not hard enough, or maybe they're too bold. His voice is much too quiet. Sometimes he gets too loud. He needs to have more dignity, or maybe he's too proud. The preacher that we've got, he must be the world's most stuck-up man, because one of the ladies told me the other day, he didn't even shake my hand. You know, you get excuses all the time. Jesus said, you feed them. And they say, we can't. This is Jesus telling them. I'll equip you, just feed them. They say, we can't. We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Seems like a legitimate response and not an excuse to me, but when you add God to it, it'll be more than enough. You remember the story. Jesus says, bring me what you've got. And He feeds them all. Some estimate up to many as 15,000. With 12 basketfuls left over. Don't miss the irony there. How many disciples are there? 12. Each one of them got a faith lesson. That's the backdrop to our text this morning. Let's read it very quickly. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go ahead of Him to the other side. While He dismissed the crowd, after dismissing them, He went up to a mountain by Himself to pray. When evening came, He was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw Him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. But when Peter got down out of the boat, he walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out His hand and caught him. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. The Sea of Galilee is some 600 feet below sea level. It's 13 miles long, is 7 miles wide. In some places it's 160 feet deep. It is surrounded by hills and mountains. And over to the west it's the Mediterranean Sea, and it sits down in the middle of these mountains. And when the wind whips through like it does at Wrigley Field, it gains steam. And when it hits the cooler waters, a storm can come up just like that. And that's the way it is in life. One of the gospel writers said it's Passover, which means that there's a full moon out. Jesus sends them away. Around 3 or 4 a.m., they find themselves just like that in the middle of the sea in trouble. John says they're about 3 miles out. They've been rowing for hours, tossed, one translation said, by the waves. This is a serious storm that is pounding them. Just because we're Christians does not mean that we're exempt from problems. He's up on the mountain praying. Mark says when he saw the disciples straining at the oar, he decides to do something. Have you ever been where the disciples are? One writer said in the middle of the sin, tossed by guilt, or in the middle of debt, tossed by creditors, or in the middle of family pressures, tossed by a crisis, or in the middle of uncertainty, tossed by an unknown future, if you're there, here's our lesson for you. I want you to know that Jesus sees you and He's coming for you. And He wants you to respond. Jesus decides to leave the top of the mountain, His communion with His Father, and walks out to them. Someone in the boat spots something out on the lake, and they're terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cry out in fear. They don't expect Jesus to show up, and I wonder during the course of the day how many of us are just like it. Not expecting Jesus to show up. What does Jesus say to them? 3 things. Take courage. It is I. I love the translation that says, I'm here. I'm here. Don't be afraid. We've often said it's the most frequent command of Jesus, and oh, how our lives would change if we really took it to heart and laid our storms down at the feet of Jesus. There's a fabulous old hymn that was published by a preacher in London who found it one day, not knowing who wrote it. It's been sung at the funerals of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Robert E. Lee. It was the favorite hymn of Rachel Jackson, who most historians say died of a broken heart. Not because her husband didn't love her, he loved her more than she could imagine, but because she had a shady past and people in the media wouldn't leave her alone. In the 1800s, can you imagine? And she felt unworthy and ashamed and gave up her will to live. The song's entitled, How Firm a Foundation. It was sung at her funeral. Your life may seem less than solid, like you are out in the water in that boat. But if you can recognize that Jesus is coming for you, and He's going to walk with you through the storm, then your entire perspective changes, even if the situation immediately doesn't. Listen to the second verse of that song. Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed. I am the Lord, and will still give you aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by thy gracious, omnipotent hand. I am here changes everything. Did you get that? I am here changes it all. Peter said, Lord, if it's you, let me come. That's always fascinated me. He's in the middle of Shoals Creek, and he figures it's better to be out of the boat than in it. Jesus says one word, come. And that's what He's saying to all of us this morning, come. You know the story. He courageously steps out of the boat, walks by faith. Here's what I believe this morning. Our teenagers need a faith that's strong enough to step out of the boat and keep walking through the challenges of adolescence and the challenges of peer pressure. They need a faith that keeps their eyes focused on Jesus. Our seniors need a faith that's big enough for them to step out of the boat and trust God with their future. Our singles need a faith that's strong enough for them to walk through the valley of loneliness and not compromise or settle. A faith that's based in the promises of God that He'll supply all their needs and work everything together for good. Our married couples need a faith that's strong enough to get out of the boat and walk against the current of the culture as they undertake the daunting task of raising children. And if you're raising a teenager through those difficult years, you better keep your eyes on Jesus. And for our seniors and our retirees, they need a faith that'll trust God to help them keep on walking through a stage of life when their health is declining and when all too frequently the love of their life is going on to be with the Lord. Keep walking. Keep walking by faith. Verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. Here is our lesson this morning. And I love what the author of the book, Fearless, says. He said, when you give the storm waters more attention than the storm walker, get ready to do what Peter did. You're going to sink just like that. Immediately, Jesus reaches down, catches Peter, says, oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt? They climb in the boat, and all of them begin to worship, saying, truly you're the Son of God. If you're in a situation right now where the storm is raging, be still and pay more attention to the storm walker than the storm, and he'll rise you above and through it and give you more peace than you can ever imagine. If you need that shelter in the time of storm, be still and know He's God. And come if you need to, as together we stand and sing.